Every regime has a favorite myth. For the Soviet Union, the myth sounded scientific. We have abolished the chaos of the market. No more crises, no more panics, no more capitalism's stupid booms and busts. Underneath that confidence was a very specific claim that there was no economic law they couldn't override with planning, decrees, and political will. No more hard budget constraints. No more, we ran out of money. No more, we can't afford this. If a factory ran a loss, the state covered it. If a plan failed, the plan was rewritten, not the system. If the numbers didn't add up, the numbers were changed. For a while, it looked like it worked. The USSR industrialized at breakneck speed. It built steel mills, power stations, nuclear weapons. It put a man in space. From the outside, it looked like the ultimate systemic hack, brute force industrial growth without the messy discipline of markets. But there was a catch. Hungarian economist János Kornai gave it a name, the soft budget constraint. In a normal system, if you make consistently bad decisions, you run out of money and you stop. In a soft budget system, you keep getting rescued. Banks roll over loans, the state fills the hole, losses are socialized. The Soviets thought this was a feature. Kornai argued it was a mathematical flaw baked into the governance model of socialism. If you remove the consequences of bad decisions at the micro level, the consequences don't disappear. They climb up the system, pile up, and eventually hit you at the macro level. Shortages, inflation, stagnation, and finally, institutional collapse. That's the impossible economic law this video is about. You can postpone reality, but you cannot repeal it. If you suppress budget constraints and price signals, they come back later as crisis. For decades, Soviet planners behaved as if that law had been turned off. They treated resource constraints, prices, and profits as political variables. If the numbers looked bad, they were corrected. If an enterprise failed, it was bailed out. If the system underperformed, the 5-year plan targets were rewritten. And then, in the 1970s and 80s, reality reappeared with interest. Growth slowed, productivity flatlined, shortages became chronic, external shocks, oil prices, arms race, grain imports exposed how fragile the system really was. When the Soviet state tried to buy time with more spending, more credit, and more money printing, the impossible law switched back on. Inflation, fiscal strain, and a loss of trust in the ruble and the regime itself.
Now fast forward. For the last 15 years, advanced economies have been running their own experiment in impossible economics. Near-zero interest rates for more than a decade in many countries. Repeated rounds of quantitative easing. Public debt pushed to levels we used to associate with post-war emergencies. Global public debt has now passed $100 trillion and is on track to approach 100% of world GDP by the end of this decade. Total global debt, public and private, remains above 235% of world GDP, even after recent inflation has chipped away at the ratio. For years, the story was, this time is different. Rates can stay at zero. Debt doesn't matter if you owe it to yourself. Central banks can always print more. We've outgrown the old constraints. And then around 2021, 2022, something snapped. Inflation surged. Central banks were forced into the fastest rate hiking cycle in a generation. Suddenly, debt had a real cost again. Governments discovered that rolling over enormous piles of obligations in a high-rate environment is not a spreadsheet exercise. It's a sovereign risk problem. That's what we mean when we say the law just switched back on. The same hard constraint that brought down the USSR, the rule that you cannot endlessly socialize losses, subsidize failure, and pretend scarcity doesn't exist, is now quietly reasserting itself inside the global financial system. This is not just history. This is the operating system your job, your mortgage, and your currency are running on right now. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it.
To see the law clearly, we have to reconstruct the system that tried hardest to break it. The Soviet Union wasn't just a big government. It was an attempt to replace markets as an information system. In a market economy, prices, profits, and losses compress millions of decisions into signals. You can argue with them, regulate them, nudge them, but you can't just erase them without losing information. When a business keeps losing money, it hits a hard budget constraint. The money runs out, creditors say no, and the firm is forced to adapt or die. The Soviet model tried to delete that port. Central planning replaced decentralized decision-making. Ministries set output targets, prices were fixed, wages were politically determined, investment flowed through a bureaucratic chain, not through capital markets. Janos Kornai's key insight was that this translated into a systemic, soft budget constraint. Enterprises knew that if they missed targets or ran losses, the state would step in. Banks knew that loans to bad enterprises would be covered by higher authorities. Local officials knew that politically connected factories would not be allowed to fail. There was no credible no. Once you remove a credible no, you don't just eliminate crises, you eliminate discipline. Unprofitable projects live forever. Broken supply chains are never restructured, they're just patched. Inefficient factories are expanded instead of closed. Shortages become chronic because no one is forced to admit that the plan is impossible at the current prices. Over time, this creates what Kornai called a shortage economy: queues, empty shelves, and hidden rationing. The system keeps promising more than it can deliver, and the gap shows up as waiting time, shoddy quality, and side deals. On top of that, the Soviet Union layered a second distortion: political pricing in macro form. Military spending took priority over consumer goods. Prestige projects absorbed massive resources. Whole sectors received investment not because they were efficient, but because they were ideologically glamorous or militarily useful. The consequence was a mathematical imbalance between promises and capacity. Households were promised rising living standards, allies were promised subsidies and cheap energy, the military-industrial complex was promised constant expansion. But the underlying productivity growth slowed sharply in the 1970s and 80s, industrial output growth fell, agriculture underperformed, and the so-called era of stagnation set in. Instead of confronting that stagnation with deep reforms, harder budget constraints, realistic prices, transparency, the Soviet system leaned deeper into its own illusion. More subsidies instead of selective shutdowns, more credit instead of restructuring, more centralized directives instead of decentralizing information. This is where the impossible economic law comes in.
You can, for a while, override micro constraints with macro decisions. You can decide that no factory will fail, no bank will recognize its losses, no unemployment will be allowed. But you can't make gravity illegal. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Soviet Union had turned its entire macro economy into one giant soft budget zone. It wasn't just firms being rescued, it was sectors, regions, allies, and ultimately the state itself. The law says, if nothing inside your system is allowed to fail, eventually the system itself will fail, because somebody has to absorb the losses. If it's not the firm, it's the ministry. If it's not the ministry, it's the central budget. If it's not the budget, it's the currency. If it's not the currency, it's the regime. The USSR spent 2 decades climbing that ladder. Act 3 is where the law flips from hidden to visible. Let's walk through how the impossible law activated inside the Soviet system. Think of it as a chain reaction in 5 stages. Stage 1, the illusion of control, 1950s, 1960s. In the post-war decades, the Soviet model looked impressive. Heavy industry grew rapidly. Urbanization surged. The USSR caught up to and in some sectors briefly surpassed parts of the West in steel, coal, and military hardware. Central planning claimed the credit. No recessions, no mass unemployment, no Wall Street panics. This period created a dangerous overconfidence in the ability of governance to override economic constraints. If you grow fast for 20 years while ignoring prices and profits, it's easy to believe you've discovered a permanent cheat code. But the cheat code was already eroding the system's resilience. Investment was heavily biased toward heavy industry and the military. Consumer sectors lagged. Innovation slowed as bureaucracy thickened and enterprises faced little pressure to innovate or die. On the surface, heroic growth. Underneath, structural misallocation. Stage 2, the era of stagnation, 1970s. By the early 1970s, the growth engine was sputtering. Productivity gains shrank. Agricultural output was erratic. The cost of keeping inefficient factories alive increased, yet the political logic of soft budgets made it almost impossible to shut anything down. This is where policy paralysis sets in. Every meaningful reform, harder budgets, price liberalization, decentralization, creates winners and losers. In a rigid, centralized system, losers can block reform more easily than winners can push it through. So the leadership chose stalling over shock. Meanwhile, external conditions shifted. The oil shocks of the 1970s temporarily helped the USSR by boosting hard currency revenues from energy exports. That cushioned the system, allowed more grain imports, and delayed the confrontation with internal inefficiency. This was the soft budget logic on a global scale. Use a windfall to avoid reform. Stage 3, the external shock, 1980s. Then the windfall vanished. In the 1980s, oil prices fell sharply from their earlier peaks. At the same time, the arms race intensified. The Soviet state was squeezed between falling revenues and rising commitments to its military, its allies, and its own population. Inside, the system had no muscle memory for productive cuts or creative destruction. Instead of restructuring, it did what soft-budget systems always do under pressure. Borrow more from abroad where possible. Print more, monetize deficits. Postpone hard choices. Mismanagement of fiscal policy, keeping spending high while revenues fell, left the USSR exposed. As one modern summary puts it, wage hikes financed by money creation helped fuel an inflationary spiral, and the drop in oil prices made it impossible to sustain both military and domestic programs. This is the point where the impossible law stopped being theoretical. For decades, the system had treated budget constraints as optional. Suddenly, foreign creditors, world energy prices, and basic arithmetic told it otherwise.
Stage 4. The currency and the collapse, late 1980s, 1991. As the crisis deepened, the weakest point in the system wasn't a single factory or ministry. It was the ruble itself. Chronic shortages and suppressed prices turned into open inflation as controls loosened. Attempts at partial liberalization exposed how mispriced everything had been. Monetary overhang, too much money chasing too few goods, unleashed a wave of price increases once controls were relaxed. Households discovered that their savings, stored in state banks in nominal rubles, could not buy what they had been promised. The state discovered that it could no longer finance its obligations at stable prices. The currency became the shock absorber for decades of systemic denial. Once trust in the ruble broke, institutional resilience collapsed with it. Political legitimacy, already weakened by stagnation and reform failures, couldn't survive a monetary shock that visible. By 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The impossible economic law had done its work. You can outlaw bankruptcy at the firm level. You can outlaw unemployment. You can outlaw bad news in statistics. But you cannot outlaw the sum of all those decisions. At some point, the bill arrives. In your currency, in your growth rate, in your political stability. That's how the law switched on in the USSR. Act 4 is about how it just switched back on for us.
The scary part of the story is not that the Soviet Union collapsed, it's that parts of its logic have quietly migrated into systems that were supposed to be smarter. For the last 15 years, advanced economies have been running a grand experiment in softening their own budget constraints. After the 2008 financial crisis, central banks slashed interest rates towards zero and kept them there for years. They created trillions in new reserves through quantitative easing. Governments ran large, persistent deficits to cushion demand. After the COVID shock, those policies were supercharged. The implicit message was, we can manage any crisis with enough liquidity. Public debt doesn't matter as long as rates stay low. Central banks can always keep borrowing costs down. This is the modern version of abolishing the business cycle. Debt piled up. According to recent IMF and OECD data, global public debt has now crossed $100 trillion and is projected to rise toward 95 to 100% of world GDP by the end of this decade. Total global debt, governments, households, firms, still sits above 235% of global GDP, even after inflation has eroded some ratios. For years, the intellectual mood was, maybe this is sustainable. Maybe we're in a new normal of secular stagnation and permanently low real interest rates. Maybe the old warnings about debt overhangs don't apply in a world of central bank omnipotence. Reinhardt and Rogoff wrote, "This time is different" as a warning against exactly that mentality. Every era of financial excess convinces itself that old laws no longer apply, until they do. And then, around 2021, 2022, the bill arrived. Massive fiscal stimulus, supply constraints, and the lagged effects of ultra-loose policy fed into the sharpest burst of inflation many advanced economies had seen in decades. Central banks were suddenly forced to choose between letting inflation stay high and erode the currency's credibility, or raising interest rates aggressively and reactivating the hard budget constraint on highly indebted states, firms, and households. They chose to fight inflation. The impossible law switched back on. Interest costs on public debt began to rise. The IMF now warns that global public debt dynamics are deteriorating. Many major economies face rising debt ratios and higher debt servicing burdens unless they change course. What does that mean in plain language? It means governments cannot forever borrow for free. Central banks cannot always keep real interest rates below growth without stoking inflation.
The soft budget constraint logic, we'll always roll you over, we'll always bail you out, starts to break when the cost of carrying the system explodes. We are not the USSR. We have markets, competitive sectors, and real price signals, but we've been quietly experimenting with softening constraints at the top of the system. Too big to fail institutions bailed out repeatedly. Chronic deficits assumed to be harmless as long as demand is weak. Political promises, pensions, health, defense, climate, tax cuts, all stacked on the same balance sheet without a credible plan to reconcile them. That's how you recreate the mathematical flaw in a different costume. The impossible law is the same. If you institutionalize rescue at every level, you don't abolish failure, you centralize it. When the adjustment comes, it hits the state and the currency instead of individual firms. The USSR reached that point in the 1980s. We have not, but our direction of travel is uncomfortably familiar. The law is no longer hypothetical. It is operating in real time through higher debt servicing costs, tighter fiscal space for shock absorption, and markets increasingly sensitive to signs of fiscal drift and policy paralysis. And because the system today is globally networked, a crisis of trust in one major sovereign doesn't stay local. It transmits through interest rates, bond markets, banking systems, and currencies. The question is not, will everything collapse tomorrow? The question is, how much resilience do our institutions actually have when this law is fully priced in?
So what do we actually do with this? The easy version of this story is doom. The Soviets ignored economic law, they collapsed, we're doing similar things, therefore collapse is inevitable. That's not the point of Inside the Soviet Economy. The point is resilience, understanding where systems break so they can be made more resistant, not just more dramatic. Let's restate the law one last time. You cannot permanently escape hard constraints. If you suppress them locally, they return globally. If you delay them in time, they return with compounding interest. The Soviet Union tried to abolish firm-level failure and price-based discipline. It got state-level failure and currency collapse instead. We are trying to smooth away private bankruptcies, recessions, and market discipline with ultra-easy money and ever-growing public backstops. If we don't adjust, the risk is not a clean cinematic crash. It's a long period of slower growth, heavier tax and interest burdens, repeated fiscal squeezes and political crises, erosion of trust in institutions and currencies. Systemic resilience starts from the opposite instinct. Let some things fail early so everything doesn't fail late. Expose bad projects to a credible no before they grow systemic. Use debt as a tool, not as an all-purpose anesthetic. Keep monetary and fiscal policy anchored in rules that survive elections and panics. On the governance side, that means accepting that not every sector, firm, or region can be permanently protected. Designing safety nets that protect people, not zombie institutions. Being honest about trade-offs, defense versus welfare versus tax levels versus debt sustainability, instead of pretending we can have everything forever at zero cost.
On the personal side, it means recognizing that your income and savings are claims on a system that is currently testing how far it can stretch its own constraints. Safe assets are only as safe as the institution and currency behind them. Skills, adaptable careers, diversified savings, and low personal leverage are your version of a hard budget constraint, your way of not becoming a soft budget ward of a stressed system. The impossible economic law that took down the USSR didn't disappear with the red flag. It's the same law that has punished over-indebted empires, bubble economies, and arrogant elites for centuries. Every generation rebrands it. Scientific planning will replace crises. This time is different. We can fine-tune everything from the center. And every generation, the law replies, no, you still pay. If you want to understand how that payment happens, where the pressure shows up first, how governance reacts under stress, which institutions bend and which ones break, that's why this channel exists. Because the next time someone tells you, we've finally beaten the old constraints, you should hear what a Soviet planner in 1975 would have heard. The countdown just started. If you want to keep decoding those countdowns before they show up in your taxes, your currency, your job, subscribe to Inside the Soviet Economy, and let's keep tracking the one economic law you can't switch off.